Hello.
Hi,
Uh,
Paul.
hello, Linda. Welcome to another Museum FAQ video conversation. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator at POW, Paul Orselli Workshop here on Long Island. And lucky me to be joined today by Linda Norris. We're going to be talking about how to transform creative ideas and creative notions into actions. But before we launch into that part of the conversation, I always like to ask guests on the videos to talk a little bit about their background so we can get a sense of sort of how you came to be where you are now.
Great. I started my museum career at age 14 at my local county historical society in upstate New York. Got a history degree, a graduate degree in museum studies, then became a first-time museum director at 24 or so at a place that had never had a director. So there was a big learning curve there for both of us, I'd say. But I think about that place, a small museum, as a place where I learned more than I could imagine. I then worked for a museum service organization in upstate New York, where I still live, and consulted, became a full-time consultant, did a stint as a Fulbright scholar in Ukraine, which was transformative for lots of reasons. And then 3.5 years ago, took on a full-time position, my first in a lot of years, as Global Networks Program Director at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience.
Wow, that's a far-reaching and eclectic and an early start to a career in museums. So that's a good segue. I'm sure you mentioned small museums, which tend to be small but mighty. They need to do lots of things and be creative with their resources. So maybe that's a good segue. We want to talk today about how to use creativity and how to be more creative in our work and our practice, but how to transform creative ideas into actions. Museums are good about talking a good game, as you well know, but not always. Sometimes it's difficult to transform these ideas or these hopes and dreams into actions. And lucky us, because you happen to be the co-author of a book on just this subject related to museums. So maybe you could just give a little pitch for the book and your co-author, and then maybe we could launch into a discussion of how people could sort of use some of the things that I'm sure are illustrated in the book
Sure.
towards their own museum practice.
So the book is Creativity in Museum Practice, and my co-author is the wonderful Rainey Tisdale, who I hope many of your watchers have also come across. We wrote the book together because we were interested in the idea of creativity, how it worked and what it meant. There was a lot of increasing research in the wider world about what creativity meant and how to use it. A lot of it coming from the tech world. To be honest, but we were really interested in what it meant for museums. And as we began work on the book, we realized we had a long conversation about whether we wanted the book to be a toolkit or a manifesto. Those were right, because some museum books are manifestos and some are toolkits. We decided ours needed to be both. We needed people to understand some creative theory, but we also wanted people to understand that the way to become creative is not to read other people's case studies, because that is just copying someone else's work. And we adapt from work all the time. I'm sure you do too. All of us do. But the understanding how creative practice works, that it's something you can learn to do. It's something you can work with your team to learn, and your organization and your community. So understanding creative practice and how it worked, and how there are tools out there that all of us can use, that was really an important part of the book. So our book is manifesto and toolkit both.
It's a manifesto toolkit.
It's a manifesto toolkit. And I think particularly now, as there's so much out there saying we need to rethink what we do. That's what every museum is saying. It's a new normal. It needs to be different. You don't just get there by magic, right? You don't go like that and it's like, oh, we're new. There's a process of creative thinking and you have to work at it. This is going to be work for all of us. Whatever this new normal is. And I hope, to be honest, it's a really different normal than what used to exist. And I love the different ways that I see people through the same way I see you now, thinking about new ways to do things, new ways to organize workers at museums, new ways to connect with communities, new ways to think about collections, new ways to think about everything. It's really inspiring how much great creative thought is out there. We all need to be doing it.
So that's great. And certainly I agree, practice makes perfect. It's kind of hard to learn how to swim or ride a bicycle by just reading a book about it. So with that in mind, maybe you could share some takeaways or some fundamentals for people who really want to apply creative thinking towards action. What are the steps, or what are the things that people really need to be thinking about? As you said, you don't just snap your fingers. What's the foundational work that really comes into creative thinking?
So I think it's really useful to understand that there are steps in the creative process. We drew on the work of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, which I pronounced wrong and a truck drove by. So in which it's a process and there are steps. The first step is preparation. To be honest, museum people love the preparation step. Let's do a lot of research. Let's do some more research. Let's maybe do some more research, right? We pretty much have that covered, except for the fact that you always want to broaden out your preparation in a way, and I can come back to that. The second step is incubation. Literally, that you just need to let it sit in the back of your head. Some people incubate best when they take a walk. Other people when they do the dishes. Whatever way it is, you need to find time in any process for that thinking. The third step is kind of when the idea comes to you. The part that most people think is the only part of the creative process, right? When the light bulb goes on and you're like, I have an idea. We could try it this way. Then there's evaluation, which is a process of saying, is this a good idea? How am I going to test it? Am I going to share it with my work colleagues at this point? Do I share it with other people? Whatever. And then implementation, right? Which is a process of always then saying, what worked? What didn't work? Do we need to go all the way back? Do we need to go 2 steps back in the process? Do we need to go 4 steps back in the process? But understanding that creative work takes all these steps is really useful. And understanding that any museum, big or small, might have any number of projects at different stages in the process, right? So you're always circling around to them.
So you mentioned, the first step, this beginning sort of gathering phase and thinking and research phase, but you also sort of alluded to maybe needing to get outside of your bubble. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I think one of the worst things you could ever hear on a project is, well, like why are you doing things this way? Well, we've always done them this way, And so how do you move outside of that bubble and your little insular world?
I think there's several different ways to do it. One is to just expand the information you take in. And it's a global world now. You and I were just talking before we started recording that someone from Russia is watching one of the videos. There is information about museums everywhere out there in the world now available to us. So one is to expand the museum world in which we're operating and how people are doing things so we can learn from. But another is to think about all the other parts of the world that are doing things that are not museums. We don't only need to learn from museums. We need to learn from libraries. We need to learn from businesses. We need to learn from anything you can imagine. So we want to look at those, all those kinds of sources. But then another part of it is to really say, well, we all exist in communities and we exist for communities. We need to be observing and talking to and listening to our communities, however you want to define that community. That community is not your board of directors. It's not just your members, and it's not just your visitors. Spend some time lurking around on your community Facebook group if that's not what you do already. Now some parts of the world are opening up. Go sit outdoors and have a coffee and listen to what people's concerns are. And I think that observation and listening part is critical, but it has to be about more voices than you ordinarily listen to.
Yeah, that's, I think that's really important. It's maybe just as important, you know, you want to obviously listen to and be in communication with your visitors and your stakeholders, but it's also interesting to try and tap into, well, who are the people who are not visiting us and why? You know, there are people who might not cross the street to come to visit you. Why is that? So of course that's a little bit more difficult to find out, you know.
But it's always possible.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you, like you say, you can lurk on the internet and find out what people say and how they really feel, what they might not say to you in person or directly. I'm just curious, you know, we often think of creativity and brainstorming. It seems like a very social, gregarious process, but what might you have thought about in terms of, I'm going to say, creativity for introverts? You know, there are people not like you and me who, you know, you're like, well, what do you think, Linda? Well, let me tell you what I think. So I'm just curious, you know,
Yes.
in your book or in your thinking about this topic, what are some different sort of modes of getting creative thinking into action across a range of people?
So Rainey and I use a lot brain writing, which is different than brainstorming. Brainstorming does privilege people like you and I. We're always happy, we have opinions, we want to engage. Brain writing is a process that you set a challenge or an idea, and people literally write down all their ideas on a piece of paper in a room. Then it gets passed to the next person, right? You're passing in a circle. And what that does, the next person then builds upon the ideas that they receive, a kind of plussing in order to add more value to something. They're not just rewriting their ideas, but you're adding to the ideas and then you pass again. And by writing, that provides an opportunity for more people to have ideas come to the fore who maybe aren't in positions of leadership or privilege in an institution, because that's often who gets to speak up. It levels the playing field for everyone, or begins to, at any rate. And actually online, we used a couple of weeks ago in a workshop at the Coalition in an online webinar, Padlet. I don't know if you know that particular, it's a virtual version of sticky notes. So we had, for our small group work, individual Padlets, which are just a website, and literally you can add notes, you can add links, you can draw, so everyone works together collectively.
So that's like an online app that you could use during a Zoom call or something.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, as they say in YouTube land, we will include more information and links and resources in the description below. So, you know, one other thing that strikes me, you know, you talk about a level playing field, which I think is important when you're developing creative partnerships. You want to have robust conversations and trustful conversations. But especially at the beginning of the process, it seems like creative ideas can be sort of fragile things, and unusual ideas might receive pushback from a variety of quarters. So I'm wondering what if you and Rainey, or in your own work, or things from the book, if you know, how do you get away from this notion of pushback, or somebody saying, well, that's a little bit too far out there.
There's a couple different things that seem to work pretty well. One is to prototype, and I know you're a big believer in this as well. Prototype anything and start small. Frame your big new idea that you want to change the world with as a small experiment. Because then leadership, it's not so scary to leadership. If it's framed as an experiment, we'll just try it. It's small, we'll just do it in the lobby. Well, frame it as an experiment, do a small version, and then you're able to say, look, this worked.
Well, and also
it's not just for exhibits. I think
right.
That's a really important
Oh
thing.
yeah, I want to write a blog post, or who knows, like how to prototype your life, because basically everything you have a question about or you want to try something out, you can use prototyping
Absolutely.
principles. It's interesting. Yeah, exactly. Start simple and do that. One thing I've always found about prototyping is it's a great equalizer, across the org chart and across sort of dynamics, social dynamics that develop once a group works together. Because if really, ultimately, especially related to exhibits, you have the interests of the visitor in mind, and you are setting up a really unbiased way of getting feedback from visitors or potential visitors, then that's the decision maker. That's the tiebreaker. Forget about what the director thinks, or the director of exhibits thinks, or the marketing team thinks. What do the visitors think? Let's set up this situation and be honest and open in interpreting and evaluating the results. So I think that's a really good piece of advice.
And I think often, and I think of this particularly in my work here at Sites of Conscience, people are worried about discussing hard issues, right? People are scared. What's going to happen? If there's anything we've learned in the past month, is that Americans and people around the world are so anxious to have challenging conversations. So I think a big part of creating real museum change is, on a leadership level, getting over the fear and surrendering your power. And that a real creative leader is someone who allows everyone in their institution their creativity to bloom. Creative leaders are not the people who only have ideas. We've all worked for people like that in our life. They have great ideas, but they really don't want anyone else's ideas. Creative leaders are people who are great gardeners. They let all the ideas flower. And now, more than ever, I think that means listening to creative ideas outside your institution. I'm really interested in some of these conversations that are coming up about how to reform museum boards. I had not thought about that particularly creatively in the way that I see some ideas coming forward, and they're amazing. And that, again, is the preparation part, right? I've circled back to say preparation is listening to all kinds of voices.
And considering all sorts of possibilities without, like you say, I mean, letting go of fear and letting go of power are two things that traditionally museums are not strong in. But hopefully we understand the importance of moving forward in that way.
And I think to kind of say the museums are not neutral movement. Big shout out to the founders, LaToya and Mike, have really made us think. We have always thought museums are neutral, but of course they never have been. And now there's this, I think the fear among some leaders is the idea that we're not going to be neutral, not in the ways that they're accustomed to. Sorry, that was a really convoluted sentence. The idea that museums have positions to take. One of the things I've learned the most from our global members at Sites of Conscience, our members around the world, from Rwanda to Cambodia to Argentina, many of the museums are founded and led by individuals who were social justice and human rights activists who've come to museums and archives work as a tool. So they know museums are not neutral, but they see their potential power. And that, I think, they're creatively able to imagine something different that, in a way, I don't think I had in the same way.
Well, I think, I don't really appreciate things that try and sit in the mushy middle, people who have a strong and sincere and enthusiastic point of view, even if it's something that strikes me initially as unusual, you sort of get pulled into that enthusiasm and that sincerity and that purpose that those organizations or those people have. So I think, the idea of a neutral museum, strikes me in the same horrible way as the idea of a touchless museum. I'm like, stop. Anyway, I'm wondering if, in our closing moments here, if you have one other sort of takeaway or one other sort of creativity truth bomb that you want to throw out there that's gonna excite people and they're saying, yeah, okay, I like those foundational ideas. I'm gonna follow up on those resources and Rainey and Linda's book, but yeah, give me one more thing to latch onto that's gonna help me turn creative ideas into actions.
Wow, you just gave me a big task here, Paul.
Well, you're creative, so.
I think I'm going to give you two. One, when Rainey and I wrote the book, the motivating force was, and the book is organized this way, about how to build your own creative practice, how to build your organization's creative practice. But all of that is designed towards the point that our communities have big issues to solve in every kind of way. And of course, now more than ever. And that our own better creative personal practice, our own better organizational creative practice can help our communities find solutions to things that are really troubling and difficult and hard. That communities are at the heart of how we think about creative practice. So that's one thing I'm going to take away, is that you need to think about how this benefits not just you, not just your organization, but how it's going to make a difference in the communities where you're located and the communities you work with. So that's one. The second is to really think about your work from an aspect of generosity rather than of scarcity. Museums, by their nature, are kind of hoarders. That's how we started. Like many other people, I have been guilty of saving those old exhibit panels that I think I might use again. So
protect the collections. Save those things. Save everything.
Save everything. What's going to work? And I think that also often applies to ideas. If we have a great idea about how we're going to do a project, we're going to hoard it and do it ourselves. We're not going to partner with other museums in our community, other community organizations, maybe even within our institution. We're going to hoard our idea so our department has more power. More than ever, this is a time for generosity. That is what And I have to say the examples from the pandemic have been incredible. Not just museums, but everyone in the world who's done generous things. The idea that there are now mutual aid societies, which I think of as kind of a 19th century kind of activity to help communities, the way people have stepped up to help all kinds of people. That generosity, that understanding that we're all in this together in the biggest global sense, whether it's about racial justice, whether it's about economic disparities, whether it's about climate change. We're going to solve that by being generous, by giving up power when we hold it, by inviting more people into the room, by not hoarding resources and ideas. So I want to leave people with the idea that generosity is an incredibly creative act.
There you are, my friends. Seek out your creative partners. That's how you get to that generous action, and find the peeps who are going to help you turn those ideas into action. Well, Linda, it's been a great pleasure speaking with you today, and I appreciate the things that you were able to share with us. As I mentioned, we will have copious resources and links below so that people can follow up not only about your book, but International Sites of Conscience and some of the other resources you mentioned. We'll have to make sure we add Padlet to that. So again, thanks very much. I appreciate you taking the time today.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Paul.
Okay, take care.
Yep, thanks.